Fecteau, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Well, I have a great conversation lined up for you today with Bob Fecteau, who's the CIO of SAIC. I ran into Bob a couple weeks ago, and I just had to have him on the show because I put him what I would call as a tier 1 CIO. And I would say he's probably in the top 5% of CIOs in the United States right now. And what I love most, more than just his ranking as a CIO, is his commitment to building CIOs, to building the profession. And that just spoke loud and clear to me as I was talking to him, is that this was something that drives him day in and day out, is spreading and building the professionalism of the CIO profession. It's only an 18-year-old profession, and he wants the same standards that apply to finance and HR and MBA programs to apply to CIOs as well. So he's put himself in a position front and center to teach about finance, to teach about vision, to teach about execution and problem solving. So take out a pencil and paper, listen to this show. There's going to be show notes, which are going to have links to good resources for you to dig into afterwards. But I hope you enjoy the show, and let's introduce Bob. How did you develop this passion for the topic, Bob?
Well, I think what happened was I realized when I worked in the federal government, I was with a bunch of people who were actually IT professionals that were practicing at the function of being a CIO. And then as I developed and started to become an actual functional CIO in business and in the government, I learned that there were a lot of skills I didn't have. Like the financial skills were really not resident in the plan until I had taken the programmatics classes at National Defense University, as well as discussing that as part of my development program at Syracuse. And it occurred to me that if I'm going to make my team better, they have to be experts in these areas. And what areas do you define, and how do you define value about what you're doing for the business? So I literally became focused on developing and executing improvements of my own team, because frankly, there is no leader that can do this job by themselves. It is so complicated, and there's so many dimensions to technology enabling a business that it requires a true teamwork application. So if we're going to do that well, then you have to have as a core principle how to build those skills in others. Because what one person can do is just a minor piece of what a whole organization can do, synchronizing everything together. And that's what it's about. It's about synchronicity, it's about sharing the load, and it's about the collective doing more than the individuals in the collective.
So this concept of improving your own team, was there a moment in which something pushed you over the edge as far as, and you also mentioned the word synchronicity and workload, was there a time where you're just like, I've got to figure out a way to do this differently? Or was there a mentor you stumbled into or a class? Like, how did it all start?
I took a couple classes that really focused on the future of enabling people. One was out of the Center for Lessons Learned out of Harvard. And it talked about motivationally improving performance by behavioral changes with people. And then I thought about it, and the whole performance of any organization is driven by people. So the leadership realm became a very interesting concept for a CIO leadership. How do you get more out of technologists that are experts in their field, yet they can't seem to see the purpose of what they're doing and how it affects a business? So I consider that my primary objective, is to teach the people where their actions are resident and relevant to what the business is doing. In other words, how do I connect a single person's effort in either a team or an individual to the success of the business to an end result? And painting that picture, I think, is the principal function of a leader in any level at any organization. So I focus on trying to make every single person's effort I guess, relevant to the success of the business. Because frankly, what you don't need is you don't need people thinking they're doing things for the sake of doing them. They have to have some kind of link to making other people or the business or the section or the division successful at accomplishing its mission and goals. And so I think leaders by nature have to be able to define what that success looks like. And I spend a lot of energy defining that.
So actually linking people's efforts to the objective of the business and developing those links, is that something that you feel that needs to be a visual process, or is it a process of coaching? Is it like, where would the CIO play in that? Like, how would they get to that point?
Yeah, so the primary thing a CIO has to do in this area is they have to take the strategy of the business and define what the technology enablement of that function is. So I literally take the business strategy and I build the IT strategy to complement it. And that's how I'm held accountable. If you don't do it this way, you end up doing IT for IT's sake. And that's the worst kind of technology support for a business, is to actually just do technology because it's there. How many times has technology come in where you've actually done it because it was just the next great thing to come out and it has no value to the business? There's a lot of stuff that happens inside the technology realm that the business doesn't understand what it does, and it's up to leaders in the CIO function to be able to explain what that value proposition is.
Have most of your learning been within the government sphere? So you've mentioned a couple programs like National Defense University. Are they sort of ahead in grooming what they expect from a CIO, or have you gained most of your knowledge from and applying most of your knowledge on the traditional education route, like through Syracuse or Harvard or such?
I think the education of a CIO is a broad-scale, broad experiential-based issue. It can't be centric. So if you went to Syracuse, for instance, or National Defense University, you're going to get their way to do it. It takes that plus experiential learning and integrating it to the leadership of people. So I would say my military background and leadership principles of people is the core foundation that I bring to the table.
Okay.
From that foundation, I have technical skills derived from three areas: formal education, experiential-based structures, as well as interacting with people on a leadership scale. So those three areas create what I consider a holistic package of IT skill leadership. It's not just IT leadership. I could lead another section of the business. I think I'm very multidimensional. But I think I'm a better force multiplier for the business in the CIO realm.
So you've used the word with me before, developing a technology leader, and you mentioned is delivering services necessary to manage IT investments. What does that mean to you? Because I love the language shift. It's a very different way of communicating from a leader point of view. If you could just kind of unravel that a little bit for us and for me, that would be great.
Core principle, you're asking about the core principles of financial management in the IT space.
You had mentioned delivering the services necessary to manage IT investments. So the services necessary to manage the IT investments. So I guess understanding what the services that are necessary would be great.
So in order to really be an effective CIO, you have to be an expert at financial management, because everything within IT costs something. And the labor that's in IT is an overhead cost to the business. The licensing that runs the technology is an overhead cost to the business. And understanding whether you're getting the best value for that money is a fundamental business imperative. And as such, it's certainly in my role here, I am responsible for every additional cost to the overhead rate of the company that technology provides for the business. So if someone decides that they're going to go around my office, for instance, and install a piece of technology, whether it's in my budget or it's paid for independently by a shadow organization, I own ultimately the responsibility to make sure that those costs are managed, controlled, and understood. It doesn't matter who buys it, but as the CIO in this company, I'm responsible for any technology costs increase to the G&A of the business for the use of technology within it. So that's kind of what I mean by being the expert. And you have to be an expert at rooting it out. You have to know where to look for when things are happening and say to yourself, how did they do that with technology that I didn't provide? So that's how you find the shadow IT organizations. It's how you find investments that are not in core with your systems. And you really have to have a good understanding of the assets edge to edge in the enterprise so that when something anomalous happens that wasn't provided by you, you have some bearing in terms of understanding what's happening. And this is an experiential-based problem. So many CIOs know their budget, they get their managing the licenses they have, and all that other stuff that happens that they should be doing or maybe should be contributing to generally doesn't, it's not my job kind of attitude. That doesn't happen here. I really do believe that my responsibility is the edge-to-edge technology enablement of this business, whether I buy it or somebody else buys it.
So it's the full accountability and responsibility for the technology assets from edge to edge. So if someone pulls a piece of technology into another department, for example, you're assuming that's your responsibility, which you're finding that doesn't necessarily happen with all organizations.
That's correct. A lot of places, like if you went and went to Amazon Web Services and used Amazon Web Services to build a product or build a capability for the company, I might not see it initially. I will figure it out though. And that's because I understand the enterprise. And that enterprise think tied to the finances of running the enterprise, applying the strategies of the business to that, are all connected together in that fabric of edge-to-edge enterprise management, edge-to-edge financial accountability, and responsibility for leading the enterprise with technology.
Okay, so we covered two, the leadership piece, we covered that first, and the second was the financial management. And do you break out communication and speaking in a business language? Do you break that out as a separate skill, or do you put that as a skill of a leader? Like, where would you put that as a part of the core skills necessary for a next generation CIO?
But the responsibility for the CIO is to actually translating the IT speak into a business relevant. And specifically, what does it mean to a business? I start with the foundation that I really am about what do we want people to do with technology. So I look at what people do today. I look at the processes that they're executing. And then I'm responsible for managing the investment of technologies against those processes when appropriate. It really is true. Someone has to throw the flag that there isn't a technology solution for everything, truthfully. Some things just aren't going to get better because you put technology in place. It's a bad process to begin with. Don't put technology in until you fix the process. If there are 5 or 10 people in the approval cycle, until you reduce the number of approvers, putting in a piece of technology to do it better and faster just means you're making the problem happen quicker, but without any efficiency gained out of it. So that's a good example. My job is to deliver value and be able to explain that value to the business for the very precious dollars they invest in technology.
So that brings in.
As such, I'm a large part of the bill for the business. So understanding how to communicate with the business effectively is a core principle that the CIO has to have. He has to be able to explain what value did you get out of that. You spent $10 million. What's the ROI? What's the net present, future present value, and how are we going to get there? So in my world, this is the core of what I'm responsible for, is getting the value for the business that they pay for.
And so in getting to that point where you're determining the value and explaining that to the business, is that something that you have a core, do you actually have a team that compiles that together? Or is that something that you look as a uniquely CIO task of analyzing that specific information?
No, I think it's a little bit different than that, Bill. I think I'm responsible for building a complete fabric that has all of the IT team thinking about value every day, about what they contribute to the business. You can't do this by yourself. It's too complicated. You have to tune the organizational structure to be able to support it. Then everybody becomes pulling on the same rope with the concept of value to the business. You have to create a culture that wants to do this.
Right. And I think that the part that I observed being a struggle is the part of turning it to the CEO, and or maybe the CFO or the board, is actually communicating that final leg, actually communicating to the peers and above peers at the CEO board level. That's where I find a lot of it had been falling apart, is communicating that value and doing it in a way that the business understands. Have you found anything that's been successful for you at that point in which you're communicating up and taking your principles and having it make sense?
The answer to that question is it's been a journey. And originally, when I probably didn't do this well earlier in my career as a CIO. So, I've been a CIO almost 20 years. So at the beginning, I would say that I was probably not as strong at explaining the budget, the plan, the cost, the value to the leadership team. But as I've matured over time, I understand how to really map the constituency, so to speak, of the leadership team. And when I interviewed for this position with Tony Morocco, it was a concept of how are we going to continue to explain the value of technology to the business in balance with what the business can afford. And as such, I generally am not experiencing any issues related to communicating value to the leadership team, to the board, or any part of the business in general.
And I saw that in your presentation that you had shared, you had briefly gone through with me, that the way you visualized this to your team and to peers, I had not seen that type of way you visualized the in the grid matrix. There was definitely a way of distilling this into tangible, easy, actionable planning steps, and the ability to take a lot of complexity and distill into something that people that weren't as versed in the technology could understand.
I think one of the keys that we do here, and I've done in the past, is we bake in what the impact to a decision is going to be. It's easy for us to determine if you take $10 million out of the budget, where is the first, second, third, and one-to-end level impact to the business, and what business impacts do we think would occur. For instance, not improving the ERP on schedule. It's a very expensive proposition to renovate the ERP systems. If you don't do it, you come out of currency with software, and now you're paying your vendor additional money on top of the regular maintenance bill to keep sufficiency and skills to keep your platform alive. Well, that has a direct correlation to business. And, adding $250,000 a year to keep a legacy application alive beyond its supported life cycle within the vendor that provides it to you, as you multiply that over the years, it gets to be a very expensive proposition. So that's a value prop, and you have a net present value to a future present value disconnect. If you keep paying $250,000 a year to keep a legacy application alive, eventually 4 or 5 years down the road, it costs more than the whole application. And that run rate additional cost to the business is the stuff I'm here to eliminate.
And that's a communication that you're actually communicating in these future value and net present value terminology, which is back to your point about communicating in a financial language versus just saying that we need to upgrade this application. So you have a wider communication skills, which makes you more effective.
I think so. Also, understanding the value. If I can reduce the cost of IT by the extra $250,000 a year, maybe you pay for an ERP upgrade, that goes directly to earnings per share for the company because I'm an overhead cost. If I can reduce overhead costs, I can improve profitability and I can improve value of the company. And that's inherent on every individual in the company, not just the IT people. But since I have such a large proponent or piece of the financial budget, we're a bigger force multiplier than anybody. So doing IT better is an imperative. It's not an option anymore.
This concept earlier you mentioned about it's not just about IT. You mentioned processes, really understanding. I think you used an example. If there's 5 people in a decision tree, that's pretty costly if we can reduce that to 2. But that means that the CIO would really need to understand process analysis and workflow. Are you thinking that is something that a CIO has to learn through time, through kind of time on the job? Or is it something like, how would someone develop this analytic skill, this business process flow analytics?
Yeah, well, part of it, because I'm an Intel professional by training, it's baked into my kind of the way I think of things. But you do still have to take some formal training to figure out how to diagnose workflows and put them into consumables. That's the benefit, by the way. It's not about learning how to break down the process. That comes out of the training. But analyzing the problem, figuring out the steps that can be minimized to allow you to become more efficient, and then translating that into a map that can be used between the business and the technologists supporting the solutions minimizes the turbulence and it minimizes the rate of failure. So it's not about learning the skills so much as establishing a common framework and common language between technologists and business people to achieve a better result. That's what the CIO does. He doesn't really do the Lean Six Sigma stuff side of it, although they have to be cognizant, they have to be fluent in that language, because that's the side of the business. Those same skills and same maps translate into what gets executed by technologists, and then it becomes your execution map. So you have to be very broadly educated in these areas, and you must understand how to internalize, translate, and make those diagnostics valuable in the solutions that you generate for the business. Because you are the glue between the business and the technologists supporting the business. Now, that's why most technology systems and projects fail. It's generally either a requirement scope creep or an insufficient definition of requirements in the business.
Which you feel could be avoided by having deeper skills on the CIO side, since they're gluing these two pieces together, the business outcome and the technology support side.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as such, I believe that one of the key roles the CIO plays in a business is that of the change agent for the organization. Because I change the systems that touch every single person, I have a huge impact on how much change occurs within a business. And it becomes a logical point of intersection for us to lead and manage.
So this concept of owning a problem, and you and I have talked a little bit about this on your beliefs regarding own the problem that I'd love for you to share. What does that mean if there is a problem, and how would a CIO own a problem within an organization from a leadership point of view?
I'm not talking about me owning the problem.
Okay.
I'm talking about every leader in the business owning the problems. So here's a good example. You have a pay problem, Bill. And it's easy for me to just say, call finance, and you, Bill, go fix it. It's a much different environment when I look and see what your pay problem was, determine how it occurred, and from that occurrence, make a correction in the way the business functions to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. That's what I mean by owning the problem. All too often, leaders will try to shove something somewhere else to get it off their plate. And I don't find that to be leadership. I think that's a principle that I call management. Leaders care about the results and the outputs of their efforts. And if one of my people has a pay problem and it comes to me to solve, I'm not going to quit until it's solved. Not only am I not going to quit until your problem, Bill, is fixed, I'm going to try to make sure that the other 300 people in the IT shop don't have it, and the other 12,700 people in the company aren't going to have that problem. That's what I mean about owning the problem. It's not good enough to say, I got a problem, and give it to somebody to fix, and it doesn't get fixed. Here's a good example. How often have you gone into a data source and found the data to be incorrect? It's easy to say, hey, the data's wrong to the person who runs the system. It's harder to fix the data or find out why the data didn't get updated when it should have been. This is a common problem with ERPs and records in like the human resource system. If your address and phone number is wrong in the system, and I happen to call you and find out your phone number is wrong, how am I going to get in touch with you? Well, I can go look you up someplace else. I can send you an email. But if I don't, make sure you fix the problem, identify why the phone number didn't get updated when we moved you from one location to another, and make sure that the workflow system behind that is adjusted so that these errors don't keep occurring, then we've got work and rework that keeps getting done. And by the way, rework is 3 times more expensive, 5 times more expensive than preliminary work. So that's what I'm talking about, owning the problem. it's not good enough to say it's broke. It's really important that everybody applies their intellect to fixing the challenges of a business end to end. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I love this concept because I think you really are challenging leaders at that point to think as a leader and someone who does not abdicate responsibility. And I think that's a really good reminder for people of what it means to be a leader. And in an organization, Bob, how are you finding was the best way to manage? I hate the word manage. What do you find is the best way to lead through those details so that something that happens in January 15th that you are expecting follow-up and follow through on, that how are you going back and checking on that detail on February 15th? Like if you put a support tool or people or systems in place to help you as the leader track these details that are important for follow-up and follow-through purposes?
Well, one of the ways we do it in the IT space is we track the service tickets. We use the metrics that are available in the service tickets. We look for repeated programs. We look for trends in problems. Like if Exchange keeps coming up a lot in service desk tickets, then we're going to do a deep dive into the Exchange server to find out why it's failing or why the users are having challenges getting mail. That's a good example. It's not good enough to just reboot the system and let it go back to failing again. You got to take a look at the root cause analysis of why it happened and then try to prevent that failure in the future. So it's using the information at your fingertips to help you be better at predicting where you're going to have problems. And from that prediction, making sure that your efforts in the future are focused on ensuring that problem is resolved in the next generation of the system in technology, for instance. But, I mean, these are just some examples of what we're doing.
No, I love it. And it might seem rudimentary, the ticket system piece, but I just find being a leader is, if leadership were so easy, everybody would be doing it. So I think it's being reminded of the importance for these leadership principles. It's critical to growing a future leader. So I love this approach because it's the details. We go into a restaurant and the details that are managed in our restaurant experience, we appreciate that. And I'm sure that flows into businesses where that approach is taking as well.
I want to really give you something on metrics versus leadership for a second.
Okay.
Measurement is the metric. We're measuring things. I really don't care too much about metrics. I care about outcome. A leader takes metrics and adjusts the behaviors of the organization based on the metrics measurements that they are seeing. They put intellect onto it. They put cause and effect onto it, and they analyze that data to create a new behavior in the business to adjust the outcome. The measurement itself doesn't do anything. For instance, I put a system in place once where we had a measurement of who did what in the workflow. And you really have to be concise about this. I showed it to the leader, and the first thing he said was, well, what's that guy do? He doesn't do enough transactions based on the comparison with the other 5 people in the office. And he said, we should fire that guy. And I said, well, what does that guy do? And he didn't know. So what he was going to do is apply a measurement without a fundamental foundation of understanding what the task was, and he was going to remove a labor year. Well, it turns out that guy's the supervisor that drives the performance from the other 4 people. So if you use metrics badly, if you do not understand the outcomes you're trying to achieve with what you're measuring, metrics can steer you very badly. And that, to me, is management. Leadership is the application of metrics in a creative and innovative way to become something better than you were when you started. And I draw that picture very clearly in my head.
That's interesting. So can you just, the last sentence or two that you said that a leader will take metrics and apply it in a creative way. So can you give an example of that? Because that's a really important statement.
Yeah. So you can measure the help desk ticket. So here's a good example, because you get it almost all the time. Password resets are probably the primary failure in an IT ticket system. If you look into a ticket system, I don't care what company you go to, the password reset issue is probably the number 1 service ticket issue. So what outcome, by analyzing that data, do you, the leader, want to achieve? Do you want to reduce the number of password resets? Is that reasonable? Or do you want to diagnose why the passwords have to be reset so often? And most often you're going to find out that the complexity of the password policy exceeds the ability of people to execute it. So if you drew the metrics of how many failed password logons and how many resets have to happen, maybe you don't need a 15-digit, very complex password to get your workforce to achieve the work results that you're trying to do. If the complexity of the security solution is preventing the people from producing predictable outcome and service, then maybe you've got to make an adjustment to your security policy within inside of the boundaries of what you're willing to accept risk in. Now you're changing an outcome.
Yeah, that's a great example. That was a good way to explain it.
If people are failing the password every time, the password policy is too complex. If the password is too complex and the policy is preventing people from doing the work you're paying them to do, then you either adjust the password policy or you find a different way. And that's leadership. The other part, saying the password thing, we reset 45,000 passwords last month, that's metrics and that's management. I don't think that's those two. I can draw the picture between the two very clearly.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think that's really important to define leadership versus management. And I love that. Well, the other pieces too is I find a lot of CIOs really are kind of dig out CIOs. They love to jump into businesses and help the company dig out of inherited. So they inherit a network that in systems and processes that may be 10, 20, 30 years old, depending on previous management. And so it's a very reactive environment. And then they get so used to being reactive to technology and to the problems of the business, and that's the culture. How does a CIO dig out of and this is a big question, of course, but how do you move an enterprise from a reactive culture to one that is a more successful, stable culture?
I don't know if I know the answer to that, other than you have to provide a vision that allows people to calibrate on a pathway forward. So
I think that's a great answer.
I guess
vision.
I can put it. Yeah, no, I'm responsible for establishing the vision of technology enablement of a business. That's my primary role. The second part of that role is to actuate the plans and execute those plans in an organized, structured, and leadership methodology that provides those services with reliability, consistency, and a predictability the business can rely upon. And that's what I really focus on. I'm not a real big turnaround CIO kind of guy. I'm a maximize value out of our investment kind of guy. And I think they're two different kinds of CIOs. One of them tend to be cut through everything, cut the systems all the way down to the absolute minimums. And the other kind, I think, is focused on getting more value for every dollar spent. I really like to focus on maximizing the dollars spent and getting the maximum value out of that. So I think my responsibility of painting the vision about where you are today and how you're going to get to someplace tomorrow is a critical skill. It's critical for all the people to calibrate upon. And that's where I think you go from being the reactive guy to being the driving the future of the business kind of guy.
Yeah, I loved your answer, vision. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I think it's, again, a great reminder for someone who might be stuck. And I think that's the issue is some CIOs just get stuck in the culture that they are inherited. And so one of the leadership principles they need is they're stuck in the weeds or they're stuck in a culture and there's been no clear vision established of how to dig out so that the business can understand. So I think your answer was completely spot on. Thank you.
If a CIO feels like he's stuck, he needs to reach out to other CIOs. He needs to go look at some other referential point to allow him to reframe the vision. A good example is I go to Microsoft every year. I don't really go because I like to sit through a week worth of PowerPoint. I go to reestablish the vision about the possibility of what could be with their product line, which I'm invested in. It's same reason I would go to like Cisco or go to another vendor or go to a conference. I'm going there to see what the art of the possible is, and then I take that art of possible, I look at the organization that I lead and see if there's a place where we should be intersecting better. And it's an experiential, continual growth process that every CIO should be engaged in. And every leader in business has to be engaged that way. Otherwise, you're going to be where you are today, 5 years, 10 years from now.
Yeah, I think I love your choice of words, the art of the possible, and just sitting in a room being reminded outside of the current day-to-day of what is possible and developing those intersections of business and technology and gluing in your mind. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful suggestion about the networking piece that is very powerful. You had mentioned that you have developed a pretty deep network over time. Have you found that has been useful for you?
Yeah, I have. And I have CIOs that I'll call and ask what they're thinking to make sure that my thinking is not validated so much, but aligned and not getting too far out of the frame. I mean, if you let me go by myself, I can get pretty wild out to the edge. But whether it's affordable, reasonable, within the technology that we think is going to happen 5 years from now, supportable, you have to really reference other people and other programs to see and make sure that you're not going too far astray. I'm not into being cutting edge, bleeding edge technology. I want to be at the market norm because that's the most stable piece that we can be doing.
Market norm. Now, one of the questions I had for you is about, so you support a sizable organization, and like any CIO and any sizable company, I'm sure you're considering different and have considered and are probably currently working with the cloud. But I love to hear your concept of leadership and vision as it applies to cloud opportunities for your business and how you lead and help the company navigate through it.
Yeah, so on the concept of this cloud and other in vogue daily technology concepts that are being delivered by the IT industry, one thing I want to start off with is we got to stop all this, frankly. There's a principle and a discipline to delivering technology that has to be put on a roadmap, that has to be put in a plan, and that has to deliver capability. If you take some of the buzzwords we've started, BYOD, cloud, SOA, service-oriented architecture, SaaS, we give the business more terminology to consider every year than they can possibly consume. And by throwing up all these new concepts, before we even master the ones that we started on, I think we're doing the business a disservice. Cloud, in my mind, is just giving processing, storage, and services to an outside agency that within the standards that we're willing to accept. We own a cloud internally, and we're cloud ready for many applications. But I think there's a wisdom for CIOs that they have to apply. One, not everything is ready for the cloud. Two, the things that are ready for the cloud, you should consider moving there when you're comfortable and you feel you understand the impact and risks to the business fully. If you don't do that and understand what external data outside your environment is about, don't go to the cloud. Three, I think you guide the business based on this risk profile that you're willing or they're willing to accept for the way their systems work. So these cloud services, we're buying cloud services now. We're in the cloud internally. We have an internal cloud capability. We externally use software as a service that's out in the cloud for key applications and key business functions. And we're, I would say, as versed as anybody in the cloud. Does that mean all the applications are in the cloud? No. I have some federal regulations that prevent me from using a full OpenStack cloud capability. Will we go in the cloud in the future? Absolutely. When the time is right, based on the investment strategy and the vision of where we're going, we'll move those components into the cloud as fast and as efficiently as we possibly can with minimum disruption to the support to the business. To me, cloud is just another feature, service, and capability we can deliver to the technology realm that improves the business functionality. Do I think everything could be in the cloud in the future? Possibly. Some of the cloud issues related to running in the business is you're transferring your capital budget into an O&M budget, which transitions from capital to cash and cost. So, those things are still not resolved inside of enterprise strategy management for technology. But we keep coming up with all these buzzy words and buzzy concepts that the leadership in the business has no idea how to apply it. And CIOs own the responsibility of translating that to a result for the business. And frankly, we change it so often, it's hard to do that. We're confusing the business more than we're helping them in these areas.
Well, I know that you have a deep passion you've shared with me for helping CIOs and for helping them get to the next level within their careers. As we wrap up, can you share, and I'm going to have specific show notes that I put on the website for people to get access to more information, but maybe you can just talk a little bit about different options that you are involved in and that would be good for CIOs listening to go explore on their own.
Well, the first thing I would tell you is that, we got to get involved. If you take the concept of a profession, which is self-policing, creating its own ethos, standardizing its support, being able to measure itself in performance, we as a profession are too junior to do that. And it's going to take leaders to get involved to define what they want the results of a profession to be in the technology management arena. If you think that the CIO function is literally only 18 years old coming up, and we're just now in 2 generations of education that's capable of delivering this level of service, we're still immature as a profession, and we're competing against operations management with MBAs that have been around since the 50s, and finance guys who've been around since the day of the abacus, for crying out loud. They expect us to be as proficient as they are with a longer-term educational background than we have. We also have to define what education platforms are needed to make sure the proficiency in our discipline are going to be good enough for the future. And that's going to require CIOs and leaders in technology to invest in the future, invest in the people that are growing to come up and replace us, to give them a predictable path of what is going to allow them to be successful. So they have to personally engage. We also have to support each other. That means that we should be more collaborative and communicative across the IT discipline. So I think that getting engaged in boards and panels, and I think every CIO should have at least some tenure or at least tentacle connection to educational facilities who are going to provide these programs to the next generation IT leader in the future. And I believe it's a leadership commitment we must all take the step towards. That's probably the best way to say it, Bill.
Well, it is a young profession, and it is, as you're mentioning, the standards and the complexity are there to have it be standardized as a profession, no different than being an accounting professional or an MBA, et cetera. And so I think in our previous talks, you said that's starting to happen at some universities that you are involved in. I think Syracuse is one of them, correct?
Correct. And I teach enterprise architecture at Carnegie Mellon and IT leadership in their IT leadership program. So I think that kind of commitment is what more CIOs need to be engaged in. I'm also a mentor in the CIO Executive Board, CIO Pathways program for CIO Executive Board out of Boston. We need to do this. We need to be engaged with this, and we have to make sure the curriculum that are designed to support technologists are developed under the hands and guidance of a CIO kind of capability. A couple of years ago, we decided that architecture was a critical component of IT leadership, and I worked with Penn State, for instance, in developing an architectural track for both the undergraduate, graduate, and executive programs. And today, Penn State delivers that IT architectural foundation as part of their curriculum. That's what I'm talking about in designing future leadership models that we have to be involved in today in shaping the future.
Well, this has been great, Bob, and I will put links on the show notes to those different resources that you've mentioned, and I applaud your commitment to the profession, and this is going to be very educational and informative for those that are listening. Is there anything that you want to add as we wrap up?
Oh, I feel pretty comfortable. I think we covered quite a bit of area, and if anybody ever needs help or they want to get in touch with me, they can get in touch with you, and you can route them if you want, or they can call me direct. I'd be happy to help if I can, and it's always a pleasure to be able to support the profession and really design out what tomorrow's going to be. Well, thank you very much, Bob, for your time.
So there you have it. That was my conversation with Bob with SAIC. I hope that was informative for you and that you learned a lot. I want to say a special thanks to Red Zone Technologies for being the sponsor of this episode today. And until next time, I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.